My Ántonia by Willa Cather. Chapter 2, Book 1. I do not remember our arrival at grandfather's farm, some time before daybreak, after a drive of nearly 20 miles with heavy work horses. When I awoke, it was afternoon. I was lying in a little room, scarcely larger than the bed that held me. In the window shade at my head was flapping softly in a warm wind. A tall woman with wrinkled brown skin and black hair stood looking down at me. I knew that she must be grandmother. She'd been crying, I could see, but when I opened my eyes she smiled, peering at me anxiously, and sat down at the foot of my bed. "Had a good sleep, Jimmy?" she said briskly. Then in a very different tone she said, as if to herself, My, how do you look like your father?" I do remember that my father had been her little boy. She must often have come to wake him up like this when he slept over. "Here are your clean clothes," she said. She went on stroking my head, stroking my coverlid with her brown hand as she talked. "But first you come down to the kitchen with me and have a nice warm bath behind the stove. Bring your thing, there's nobody about." Down to the kitchen struck me as curiosity. It was always out in the kitchen at home. I picked up my shoes and stockings and followed her through the living room down to the flight of stairs and a basement. This basement was divided into a dining room at the right of the stairs and a kitchen at the left. Both rooms were plastered and whitewashed. The plaster laid directly on the earth walls, as it used to be in dugouts. The floor was of hard cement. Up under the wooden ceiling there was a little half window with the white curtains and pots of German and wandering Jew in the deep sills. As I entered the kitchen, I sniffed a pleasant smell of gingerbread baking. The stove was very large, with a bright nickel trimming, and behind it there was a long wooden bench behind the wall, and a tin against the wall, and a tin tub in which grandmother put hot and cold water. She brought the soap and towels. I told her I was used to taking my baths without help. "Can you do your behind your ears, Jimmy? Are you sure? Well, I call you a right smart boy." It was pleasant there in the kitchen. Sun shone into my bathwater through the west half window, and a big-mouthed cat came up and rubbed itself against the tub, watching me curiously. While I scrubbed, my grandmother bristled herself in the dining room until I called anxiously, "Grandmother, I'm afraid the cakes are burning." Then she came laughing, waving her apron before as if she were shooing chickens. She was a spare, tall woman, a little stooped, and she was apt to carry her head thrusting forward in an altitude of attention, as if she were looking at something or listening to something far away. As I grew older, I came to believe that this was only because she was so often thinking of things that were far away. She was quick-footed and energetic in all of her movements. Her voice was high and rather shrilly, and she often spoke with an anxious inflection, for she was eating desirous that everything should go with due order and decorum. Her laugh, too, was high and perhaps a little strident, but there was a lively intelligence in it. She was then 55 years old, strong of unusual endurance. After I was dressed, I explored the little cellar next to the kitchen. It was dug out under the wing of the house and was plastered and cemented, with a stairway and an outside door by which the men came and went. Under one of the windows there was a place for them to wash when they came in from work. When my grandmother was busy about supper, I settled myself on the wooden bench behind the stove and got acquainted with the cat. He caught not only rats and mice, but gophers, I was told. patch of yellow sunlight on the floor traveled back towards the stairway, and grandmother and I talked about my journey and about the arrival of the new Bohemian family. She said that they were to be our nearest neighbors. They did not talk about the farm in Virginia, which had been her home for so many years. But after the men came in from the fields, we were all settled at the supper table, and then she asked Jake about the old place and about our friends and neighbors there. My grandfather said little. Then when he first came in and kissed me and spoke kindly to me, but he did not demonstrative. But he was not demonstrative. Sorry, I don't know the word. I felt at once his deliberateness and personal dignity, and was a little in awe of him. The thing one immediately noticed about him was his beautiful, crinkly, snow-white beard. I once heard a missionary say it was like the beard of an Abraham sheik. His bald crown not only made it more impressive. Grandfather's eyes were not all like those of an old man. They were bright blue and had a fresh, frosty sparkle. His teeth were white and regular, so sound that he had never been to a dentist in his life. He had a delicate skin, easily roughened by the sun and wind. When he was a young man, his hair and beard were red. His eyebrows were still coppery. As we sat at the table, autofungus and I kept stealing covert glances at each other. Grandmother told me while she was getting supper that he was an Austrian who came to this country a young boy and had led an adventurous life in the far west among mining camps and cow outfits. His iron constitution was somewhat broken by mountain phenom, and he had drifted back to living in a mother country for a while. He had relatives in Bismarck, a German settlement to the north of us, but for a year now he had been working for grandfather. The minute supper was over, Odo took me to the kitchen to whisper to me about a pony down in the barn that had been bought for me at a sale. He had been riding him to find out whether he had any bad tricks, but he was a perfect gentleman, and his name was Duke. Fotis told me everything I wanted to know. He had long lost his ears in a Wyoming blizzard when he was a stagecoach driver and how to throw a lasso. He promised to rope a steer for me before sundown next day. He got out his champs and silver stirrups to show them to Jake and me, and his best cowboy boots with top stitches in bold designs, roses, and true leather knots, and undraped female figures, which he solemnly explained were angels. Before I went to bed, Jake and Odo were calling up to the living room for prayers. Grandfather put on silver-rimmed spectacles and read several psalms. His voice was so sympathetic, he read so interestingly, that I wish he had chosen one of my favorite chapters in the Book of Kings. I was in awe of his intonation for the word psalm. He shall choose our inheritance for us, the excellence of Jabak, who he loved, Salam. I had no idea what the words meant. Perhaps he had not, but he uttered it. It became oracle, and the most sacred of words. Early the next morning, I ran out of doors to look about me. I'd been told that ours was the only wooden house west of Black Hawk until we came to the Norwegian settlement, where there were several. Our neighbors lived in sewed houses and dugouts, comfortable, but not very roomy. Our white-framed house, with a story and a half-storyer above the basement, stood at the east end of what I might call the farmyard, with the windmill close by the kitchen door. From the windmill, the ground sloped westward down to the barn and garneys and big yards. This slope was trampled hard and bare, and washed out in the winding gullies by the rain. Beyond the corn cribs, at the bottom of the shallow draw, was a muddy little pond, with rusty willow bushes growing about it. The road from the post office came directly by our door, crossed the farmyard, and curved around this little pond beyond which it began to climb the gentle swell of unbroken prairies to the west. There along the western skyline, it skirted a great cornfield, much larger than any field I've ever seen. This cornfield and sorghum patch behind the barn were the only broken lands in sight. Everywhere as far as the eye could reach, there was nothing but rough, shaggy red grass, most of it as tall as I. North of the house, inside the plotted fire breaks, grew a thick-set strip of box elder trees. Low and bushy, their leaves already turning yellow. This hedge was nearly a quarter of a mile long, but I had to look very hard to see it at all. The little trees were insignificant against the grass. It seemed as if the grass were about to run over them, and over the plum patch behind the sod chicken house. As I looked about me, I felt the grass was the country, as the water is the sea. The red of the grass made all the great prairie the color of wine stains or a certain seaweed when they were first washed up. And there was so much motion in it. The west country seemed somehow to be running. I'd almost forgotten I had a grandmother when she came out, her sunbonnet on her head, a grain sack in her hands, and asked me if I did not want to go to the garden with her to dig out potatoes for dinner. The garden, curiously enough, was a quarter of a mile from the house, and the way to it led up a shallow draught past the cattle corral. Grandmother called my attention to a stout hickory cane, tipped with copper, which hung by a leather thong from her belt. This, she said, was her rattlesnake cane. I must never go to the garden without a heavy stick or a corn knife. She had killed many good rattlers on her way back and forth. A little girl who lived on the Black Hawk Road was bitten on the ankle and had been sick all summer. I can remember exactly how many times the country looked to me as I walked beside my grandmother along the faint wagon track on that early September morning. Perhaps the glide of long railways traveled was still with me, for more than anything else I felt motion in the landscape, in the fresh, easy-blowed morning wind in the earth itself, as if the shaggy grass were a sort of loose hide, and underneath it herds of wild buffalo were galloping alone. I could not have found the garden except perhaps for the big yellow pumpkin that laid about me unprotected by their withering vines, and I felt very little interest in it when I got there. I wanted to walk straight on through the red grass and over the edge of the world, which could not be very far away. The light air about me told me that the world ended here. Only the ground and sun and sky were left, and if one went a little farther, there would be only sun and sky, and one would float off into them, like the tawny hawks which sailed overhead, making slow shadows on the grass. While grandmother took the pitchfork, we found standing where the rows and dug potatoes, which I picked them out of the soft brown earth and put them into a bag. I kept looking up at the hawks that were doing what I might so easily do. When grandmother was ready to go, I said I would like to stay up there in the garden a while. She peered down at me from under her sunbonnet. "Aren't you afraid of snakes?" "A little," I admitted. "But I would like to stay somehow, anyhow." "Well, if you see one, don't you have anything to do with him? The big yellow brown ones won't hurt you. They're bull snakes, and help to keep the gophers down. Don't be scared if you see one. Look out of that hole in the bank over there. There's a badger hole. He's as big as a big possum, and his face is striped black and white. He takes chickens once in a while, but I won't let the men hurt him. In a new country, a body feels friendly to the animals. I like to have him come out and watch me when I'm at work." Grandmother swung the bag of potatoes over her shoulder and went down the path, leaning forward a little. The road followed the windings of the draw. Then she came to the first bed and waved at me and disappeared. I felt alone with this new feeling of lightness and content. I sat down in the middle of the garden where snakes could scarcely approach unseen and leaned my back against a warm yellow pumpkin. There were some brown cherry bushes growing along the furrows, full of fruits. I turned back the papery triangle sheaths that protected the berries and ate a few. All about me, giant grasshoppers, twice as big as any I've ever seen, were doing acrobatic feats among the dried vines. The gophers scurried up and down the blotched ground. There in the sheltered draw bottom, the wind did not blow very hard, but I can hear it singing its humming tune on the level. And I could see the tall grasses wave. The earth was warm under me, and warm as I crumbled it through my fingers. Queer little red bugs came out and moved in slow squadrons about me. Their backs were polished vermins with black spots. I kept as I sat still as I could. Nothing happened. I did not expect anything to happen. I was something that laid under the sun and felt it like the pumpkin, and I did not want to be anything more. I was entirely happy. Perhaps we feel like this when we die and become part of something entire, whether it's sun and air or goodness and knowledge. At any rate, this is happiness, to be dissolved into something complete and great. When it comes to one, it comes as naturally as sleep. That's the end of chapter 2. Please remember to like, subscribe, comment, and view my channel for any more content. For the following chapter, I will be reading that tomorrow.